My mom and dad rolled their eyes at me in court, thinking they had already won. But the judge was stunned into silence when he saw the one piece of evidence they forgot existed. I'm Maya, and this is the story of how my parents tried to ruin me, but ended up destroying themselves. If you love stories about instant karma and seeing toxic people get exactly what they deserve, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Let's get into the story. The morning sun hit the fabric swatches on my desk, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I took a sip of black coffee, enjoying the bitter warmth. This was my sanctuary, my interior design studio, built from scratch, brick by brick, anxiety attack by anxiety attack. At 31, I finally felt like the walls around me were solid. I had no idea a wrecking ball was about to smash through them. The buzzer for the front gate rang, startling me. I wasn't expecting clients. When I checked the monitor, a man in a nondescript windbreaker was shifting his weight from foot to foot, holding a clipboard. "Delivery for Maya Hart," he crackled through the intercom. I buzzed him in. I signed for the envelope without thinking, assuming it was a contract from the vendor in Milan. But when the door clicked shut and I flipped the envelope over, my breath hitched in my throat. The return address wasn't a vendor. It was a law firm I didn't recognize, located in a town I hadn't visited in 15 years. Oak Creek. The name of the town alone made my stomach turn over. My fingers felt numb, like I'd plunged them into ice water. I sat down heavily in my office chair, the leather creaking in the silence. I used a letter opener to slip the top, my hand trembling just enough to make a jagged tear in the paper. I pulled out a stack of documents. The legal jargon was dense, but the bolded words jumped out at me like warning flares. Plaintiff, Robert and Linda Hart. Defendant, Maya Hart. Action, Filial Support claim. I stopped breathing. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. I forced my eyes to scan the summary paragraph. Seeking monthly maintenance support. Parents are destitute. Legal obligation of adult child to provide for indigent parents. They wanted money. My money. I dropped the papers onto the desk as if they were burning my skin. I hadn't spoken to Robert and Linda in 15 years. I didn't call them mom and dad. Not in my head, and certainly not out loud. They were the people who viewed me as a burden, an expense, a mistake to be managed until I could be discarded. I stood up and walked to the window, hugging my arms around my chest. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I thought I was safe. I thought the distance, the name change on my business license, and the silence had been enough. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unknown number. I stared at it. I knew, with a sick, sinking certainty, who was on the other end. I picked it up. "Hello? Maya?" A voice purred. It was smooth, like molasses over gravel. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice failing me. "It's retirement, sweetheart," my mother's voice chimed in from the background, sharp and shrill. "We saw your feature in that magazine, Top Designer Under 40. You've done well. It's time to pay your dues." "I don't owe you anything," I said, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. "The law says otherwise," my father laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a dry, scratching noise. "We're old. We're broke. And you're our golden goose. See you in court, Maya." The line went dead. I looked down at the papers again. They weren't just asking for help. They were suing me for nearly 30% of my monthly income. They didn't want a relationship. They wanted a paycheck. I sank to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The sunlight still hit the desk, but the room felt cold. The sanctuary was breached.
The monsters weren't under the bed anymore. They were at the door, and they had brought the law with them.
The waiting room of Vance and Associates smelled like lemon polish and money. I sat on a velvet sofa that probably cost more than my first car, bouncing my leg nervously. Every time the receptionist typed on her keyboard, the clack, clack, clack sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. Mr. Vance was a man who looked like he had been born wearing a suit. He ushered me into his office, a cavernous space lined with thick law books. I laid the papers on his mahogany desk. He put on his reading glasses and read in silence. The silence stretched for an eternity. I watched a fly buzz against the window pane, trying desperately to get out. I knew exactly how it felt. Finally, he took off his glasses and sighed. It was a heavy, tired sound. "Filial responsibility laws," Vance said, tapping the document. "They are ancient, rarely enforced, but in this state, they exist. If your parents can prove they are indigent, meaning they can't pay for basic living expenses, and that you have the ability to pay, the court can order you to support them." "But I haven't seen them in 15 years, I argued, my voice rising. They were nightmares. They didn't feed me enough. They locked me in my room for days. Doesn't that matter?" Vance looked at me with sympathetic but hard eyes. "In the eyes of the law, unless there is documented proof of abuse, police reports, conviction records, it's just hearsay. Do you have police reports, Maya?" I slumped back in the chair. "No, I was a kid. I was scared. I just ran away as soon as I could." Then, to the court, you are simply a wealthy daughter refusing to help her poor, aging parents. I felt the bile rise in my throat. It was the perfect trap. They had lived their lives recklessly, spending every dime, and now they were using their own failure as a weapon against my success. "I can't let them back into my life," I whispered. "It's not about the money, it's the control. If I pay them, they win. They'll never leave me alone." Vance nodded. "Then we try to settle. We offer a lump sum, a go-away fee. It's cheaper than a trial and keeps them out of your life." We drafted the offer right there. $10,000. A check, handed over in exchange for a signed agreement to never contact me again. It was a lot of money, but the price of my freedom was worth it. 2 days later, Vance called me. "They rejected it," he said bluntly. "Rejected it?" I asked, gripping my phone. "That's $10,000. "They don't want a lump sum, Maya. Their lawyer said, and I quote, 'Why take a crumb when we own the bakery?' They want $3,000 a month, indefinitely." I dropped the phone on the couch and stared at the wall. They didn't just want money. They wanted to bleed me. They wanted a tether that would keep me attached to them until the day they died. I closed my eyes and saw my father's smirk. I heard my mother's laugh. They were enjoying this. They knew I had no police reports. They knew I had erased my past to build my future. And now, that blank slate was my greatest weakness. I picked the phone back up. "Mr. Vance." "I'm here." "We go to court," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I'm not paying them a single cent." "Maya," Vance warned, "without evidence, it's going to be a steep hill to climb. They will play the victim. It will be ugly." "I don't care," I lied. I cared. I was terrified. "Just tell me what we need to do." "Dig," he said. "Go through every scrap of paper you have from your childhood. Medical records, school records, anything we can find. We need a smoking gun." I hung up and looked at the closet in the hallway. On the top shelf, shoved behind winter coats and old tax returns, was a dusty plastic bin. It contained the few things I had managed to take with me when I left home at 16. I hadn't opened it in over a decade. I dragged a step stool over, my hands shaking. I was going to have to dig up the ghosts I had spent 15 years burying. The plastic bin hit the hardwood floor with a dull, hollow thud that echoed in the empty hallway.
It was a cheap, translucent blue container, the kind you buy at a discount store for $5. I stared at the lid, taped shut with peeling masking tape. Written on it in black marker in my own 16-year-old handwriting was just one word: mine. I sat cross-legged on the floor, took a deep breath, and ripped the tape. It made a sharp, tearing sound that felt like ripping a bandage off old skin. The smell hit me first, a musty blend of old paper, vanilla body spray, and the distinct, stale scent of a life interrupted. I started sifting through the layers. There was a sketchbook filled with angry, charcoal drawings of empty rooms, a mix CD with road trip written on it, a trip I never took, a dried rose from a boy named Tyler, who'd been too afraid to pick me up at my house because my father was always yelling. My hands were shaking as I reached the bottom. There was a small, clear Ziploc bag. Inside was a plastic hospital bracelet, the edges sharp and uncomfortable looking. St. Mary's Hospital, 2009, patient Maya Hart. I held the bracelet up to the light. The memory washed over me, cold and clinical. I was 16. My appendix had burst. I remembered the pain, like a hot knife twisting in my gut. I remembered my father screaming in the emergency room waiting area, not about my health, but about the insurance. They had let the policy lapse to pay for a new truck. We can't afford this. Do you know how much a surgery costs, you stupid girl? I remembered waking up in the recovery room, the beeping of the monitor, the sterile smell of antiseptic. I waited for them to come in. I waited for hours, then days. They never came. Instead, a woman in a gray suit had come in. Mrs. Gable. She had a kind face but sad eyes. I remember her sitting by my bed, holding a clipboard. "Maya," she had said softly, "your parents and we've come to an arrangement. The state is going to help with your bills, but there are some papers that had to be signed." I had been too drugged up on painkillers to understand. I just knew the bills stopped being an issue, and I spent the next 2 years living in a group home until I aged out at 18. I always assumed my parents had just dumped me there, abandoned me. But Vance's words echoed in my head. Unless there is documented proof. I looked at the hospital bracelet again. Why would the state pay for a surgery for a child who had parents? The state doesn't pay for anything unless it has to, unless the child belongs to the state. My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. "Arrangement," Mrs. Gable had said. I scrambled for my phone, my fingers fumbling over the screen as I dialed Vance's number. It was late, past 8 in the evening, but he picked up on the second ring. "Maya, is everything all right?" I said, "The year 2009. I was 16. I had emergency surgery at St. Mary's. My parents didn't have insurance." "Okay," Vance said slowly. "That's unfortunate, but medical debt doesn't absolve them of—" "No," I interrupted, standing up and pacing the hallway. "They didn't pay. They didn't pay a dime. Someone else did. A woman named Mrs. Gable. She was a social worker." The line went silent. I could hear Vance shifting in his chair. "Maya," his voice was sharper now, more focused. "Do you remember signing anything? Did your parents sign anything?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I was on morphine. But they stopped coming. I never went back to their house. I went into the system. I always thought it was informal, just them kicking me out." "The system doesn't work informally," Vance said. The tiredness was gone from his voice. "If you went into state care and the state paid for a surgery that expensive, there was a transfer of custody. Can you find it? Can you find the records from 2009? If a transfer happened, there's a paper trail. I'm going to subpoena the Department of Child and Family Services first thing in the morning, and St. Mary's billing archives." I looked down at the plastic bracelet in my hand. It looked like trash, a piece of plastic junk, but it felt heavy. "If we find what I think we're going to find," Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper, Then they didn't just abandon you, Maya. They sold you out to save their credit score. I hung up the phone. I looked at the bracelet one last time before dropping it back into the box. I wasn't scared anymore.
48 hours before the trial. I wasn't designing. I was pacing. My studio apartment had become a cage of nervous energy. I had reorganized my spice rack 3 times and color-coded my bookshelf, but nothing could drown out the ticking clock. Every time my phone screen lit up, my stomach did a somersault. Vance had been silent for 3 days. Silence in a legal battle usually meant a dead end. When the call finally came, it was late afternoon. Rain was lashing against the window, blurring the city lights into smears of gray and gold. "Maya," Vance said. His voice was different. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by a low, simmering intensity. "Can you come to the office? Now." I asked as I grabbed my keys. "Did you find it?" He replied, "I found everything, and it's worse than we thought." 30 minutes later, I was back in the leather chair across from Vance. The office was dark, illuminated only by a brass desk lamp that cast long shadows across the mahogany. In the center of the pool of light sat a single manila envelope. It was thick. Vance didn't say a word. He just slid the envelope across the desk toward me. My hands felt cold as I opened it. The smell of old paper drifted out, that same musty scent from my plastic bin, but stronger. These were photocopies of microfiche records from the Department of Child and Family Services, stamped with the official seal of the state. I pulled out the top document. It was a form, dense with legal text, dated November 14th, 2009. Title: Voluntary Relinquishment of Parental Rights. My eyes scanned down to the signatures at the bottom. There they were: Robert Hart, Linda Hart. The ink was black and bold. They hadn't hesitated. The signatures weren't shaky. They were firm. "Read Clause 4, Vance said quietly. I moved my finger down the page. Clause 4. In exchange for the state assuming full financial responsibility for the minor's medical expenses, appendectomy, and post-operative care, the biological parents agree to sever all legal custodial ties and forfeit any future claim to the minor's estate, earnings, or personhood." I read it twice, then a third time. "They traded me," I whispered. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. To save $12,000? "It gets better," Vance said, flipping to the next page. "Here is the reinstatement form." I looked at the paper. It was blank. "They never filed it," Vance explained. "When you turned 18, you aged out of the system, but legally, they haven't been your parents since 2009. In the eyes of the law, you are a stranger to them." I sat back, the papers crinkling in my grip. A strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. For 15 years, I had carried the guilt of leaving them. I had wondered if I was the bad daughter, if I was the one who broke the family. But I hadn't broken anything. They had sold the pieces years ago. "So the lawsuit is dead?" "Oh, it's dead," Vance said, a small predatory smile touching his lips. "But we aren't just going to kill it, we're going to bury it." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "They don't know we have this. These records were sealed in the juvenile archives. They think you're just going to come in there with stories about a bad childhood. They are going to lie, Maya. They are going to get on that stand and perjure themselves to get your money." "So we wait?" "We wait," Vance confirmed. "We let them tell their story. We let them paint themselves as the loving, sacrificing parents. We let them dig their own grave, shovelful by shovelful. And then," he tapped the document with his pen, "we push them in."
I looked at the signatures one last time, Robert Hart, Linda Hart, and felt a steel door slam shut in my heart. "Okay," I said. "Let's go to court." The courthouse smelled of floor wax and misery. It was a sterile, echoing building where people came to end marriages, fight for custody, or, in my case, defend their right to exist. Vance walked beside me, his briefcase swinging in a steady, confident rhythm. I was wearing my best charcoal suit, armor for the modern woman, but underneath, my skin felt too tight. We pushed through the double doors of courtroom 4B. They were already there. I stopped dead in the aisle. My parents were sitting at the plaintiff's table. Or, rather, two people who looked like my parents, but filtered through a tragic lens. My father, a man who used to wear gold chains and drive a lifted truck, was wearing a suit that was clearly 2 sizes too big. It hung off his shoulders, making him look shrunken and frail. My mother, who I remembered smelling of expensive vanilla perfume and hairspray, was wearing a faded, gray knit cardigan. There was a visible hole in the elbow. It was a costume, a carefully curated wardrobe of poverty. "Don't look at them," Vance murmured, guiding me to our table. I sat down, keeping my eyes fixed on the wooden bench. Judge Holloway entered the room, a severe-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses and a hairline that had retreated in surrender. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had heard every lie in the book and was bored of them all. "Case 409, the bailiff droned. "Hart versus Hart." My parents' lawyer, a greasy man named Mr. Finch, who looked like he chased ambulances for sport, stood up. "Your Honor," Finch began, his voice dripping with manufactured outrage, "my clients are destitute. They are elderly citizens who poured every drop of their blood, sweat, and savings into raising their daughter. They sacrificed their own retirement to ensure she had a future. And now that she is a wealthy, successful business owner, she has cast them aside like trash." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Sacrifice? They sacrificed me! The judge nodded slowly, scribbling notes. "Call your first witness." My mother took the stand. She walked with a limp I had never seen before. She sat down, clutching a tissue in her hand, dabbing at dry eyes. "Mrs. Hart," Finch asked softly, "can you tell the court about your financial situation? It's hard," she quavered. Her voice was thin, trembling. "We have nothing left. The medical bills, from when Maya was sick, they drained us. We never recovered." I audibly gasped. Vance's hand clamped onto my forearm, hard. "Silence," his grip said. "You paid for her medical care?" Finch pressed. "Oh, yes," she lied. She looked straight at the judge, her eyes wide and innocent. "When she had her surgery at 16, it cost thousands. We emptied our 401k, we took out a second mortgage. We did it because we loved her. We wanted her to live." She blew her nose loudly into the tissue. "And how did Maya repay this kindness? She left." Maya sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "We just wanted to be a family." The courtroom was silent, save for her theatrical sniffling. I looked at the judge. He was leaning forward, his expression softening. He believed her. Why wouldn't he? Who would lie about saving their dying child? Then, for a split second, my mother lowered the tissue. She looked across the room at me. The tears were gone, her eyes were dry and hard as flint. And then the corner of her mouth twitched upward. A smirk, a tiny, imperceptible smirk that said, "I've got you." She winked. I felt sick, physically, violently sick. It was a masterclass in manipulation. "Your witness?" Finch said, sitting down with a satisfied thump. Vance stood up. He didn't pick up his notes. He didn't pick up the envelope. He just buttoned his jacket and walked toward the witness stand. "Mrs. Hart?" Vance said, his voice pleasant, almost friendly. "You mentioned a specific surgery when Maya was 16, an appendectomy, correct?" "Yes," she sniffed. "And you stated, under oath, that you paid for this surgery personally." "We did," she said firmly, lifting her chin. "Every penny." Vance nodded. He walked back to our table and picked up the thick manila envelope. He held it in his hand, weighing it, letting the silence stretch until the air in the room vibrated with tension. "No further questions for this witness at this time, Your Honor, but we reserve the right to recall her." My mother frowned, confused by the lack of a fight. She limped back to her seat, shooting a confused look at my father. He just shrugged and rolled his eyes at me, a gesture so familiar it made my stomach clench. "Drama queen," his eyes said. "Just pay us." They thought they had won the round. They didn't know the bell hadn't even rung yet.
The defense calls Maya Hart to the stand. My legs felt like lead as I walked to the witness box. I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. My hand resting on a Bible that felt far too heavy. I sat down, and the wooden chair bit into my spine. Finch didn't wait. He was on me like a wolf on a wounded deer. "Miss Hart," he began, pacing in front of me, "is it true that your business, Hart Interiors, grossed over $200,000 last year?" "Yes," I said quietly. "And is it true that you own a condo in the city, a car, that you take vacations to Italy?" "I work hard," I defended myself. "I built my business from nothing." "And yet," he sneered, "while you're sipping espresso in Rome, your parents are eating canned beans in a trailer park. Do you find that fair?" "They aren't poor because of me," my voice shaking. "They're poor because they gambled, because they bought things they couldn't afford." "Objection," Finch barked. "Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Holloway sighed. He looked at me over his glasses, and for the first time I saw disappointment. To him, I was just another millennial refusing to care for the elderly. Finch smiled. He was done with me. No further questions. Then it was Vance's turn. He didn't stand up. He just looked at me from the table. "Maya, tell the court why you left home at 16. I took a deep breath. This was it, the truth. "I left because I was afraid. I left because my father would throw plates when he lost money on scratch-off tickets. I left because my mother would lock the pantry so I couldn't eat if I didn't clean the house perfectly. I was a servant, not a daughter." I looked at the jury box, but there was no jury, only the judge. So I looked at my parents. They weren't looking down in shame. They were looking at each other. My father nudged my mother. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. At first, I thought she was crying. Then I heard it. A snort. She was laughing. "It's not funny," I snapped, losing my composure. "You locked me in the basement when I got a B in math." My father openly rolled his eyes, throwing his head back against the chair. He looked at the judge and mouthed the word crazy. "Your Honor," my father spoke up, ignoring his lawyer. "She's always had a vivid imagination, a drama queen. We gave her everything." "Quiet in the gallery," the judge warned, but he didn't sound angry at them. He sounded weary of me. My mother leaned forward, catching my eye. She smirked, a cruel twisting of her lips that I had seen 1,000 times before. She whispered loud enough for me to hear, "You're pathetic." I felt the tears sting my eyes, It was happening again. I was 31 years old, a CEO, a homeowner, and yet in this room, I was 6 years old and helpless. They were winning. They were gaslighting me in real time, and the legal system was handing them the match. "I'm not lying," I whispered, but it sounded weak even to my own ears. Vance stood up. The air in the room changed. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't look at me. He looked at my parents, who were still snickering behind their hands like schoolyard bullies. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a scalpel, "the plaintiff claims to have given her everything. They claim to be the legal, loving guardians of Maya Hart." "We've established this, counsel," Judge Holloway said impatiently. "Move it along." "I would like to submit a piece of evidence to the court," Vance said, walking toward the bench. He held the manila envelope in both hands, like a holy relic. Exhibit C, obtained via subpoena from the Department of Child and Family Services, sealed archives dated 2009. My father stopped smiling. He squinted at the envelope. My mother froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. Vance placed the envelope on the judge's bench. "What is this?" the judge asked, picking it up. "The truth, Your Honor," Vance said softly. "The reason why the plaintiffs didn't pay for that surgery, and the reason they have no standing in this court." The room went silent. The only sound was the tearing of paper as Judge Holloway opened the seal.
Judge Holloway read the document. Then he read it again. The silence in the courtroom stretched so tight I thought it might snap. A fly buzzed against the fluorescent lights overhead, the only sound in a room holding its breath. I watched the judge's face. The boredom was gone. The annoyance was gone. His eyebrows drew together, and a flush of color, a deep, angry red, crept up his neck. He slowly removed his wire-rimmed glasses and set them on the bench with a deliberate click. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. and Mrs. Hart," the judge said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the air feel heavy. "You stated earlier, under oath, that you paid for your daughter's appendectomy in 2009. You stated that you have been her continuous, supportive guardians." My father straightened his oversized suit jacket, sensing a shift, but misreading the direction. "That's correct, Your Honor. We sacrificed everything." "We nearly lost the house," my mother added, sniffling again. She reached for her husband's hand, playing the part of the weary martyr to perfection. "Is that so?" The judge picked up the paper. "Then can you explain to this court why I am holding a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights form, dated November 14th, 2009, signed by both of you?" The sniffle stopped, mid-breath. My mother froze. It was like watching a statue crack. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, her eyes darting to their lawyer. "I think you do," Judge Holloway said, his voice rising. "This document states that you surrendered custody of Maya Hart to the State Department of Child and Family Services. Specifically, Clause 4 notes that this surrender was executed, and I quote, "to avoid financial liability for emergency medical procedures." My father's face went gray. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face for the last hour vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. That was just paperwork," my father blurted out, standing up. "It was a financial maneuver. Our accountant told us." "Sit down," the judge barked. The sound cracked like a whip. My father collapsed back into his chair. "You traded your daughter to the state to save $12,000, the judge said, shaking the paper at them. "And worse,
You never filed for reinstatement. You let her age out of the system. Legally, you haven't been her parents for 15 years. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Even their own lawyer, Mr. Finch, looked horrified. He pulled away from them, creating a visible gap at the table. "Your Honor, we can explain," my mother wailed. But the tears were real now. They were tears of terror. "We loved her. We didn't mean to—" "You didn't mean to what?" The judge cut her off, his eyes blazing with disgust. "You didn't mean to abandon her? Or you didn't mean to get caught lying about it to a superior court judge?" I sat there frozen. I looked at my parents. They weren't rolling their eyes anymore. They weren't laughing. They were shrinking. They looked small, pathetic, and terrified. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who was afraid. "You came into my courtroom," the judge continued, his voice trembling with suppressed rage, "dressed in costumes, crying fake tears, attempting to use a law designed to protect vulnerable elders to extort a woman you legally disowned." He looked at me then. His expression softened into something profound. Pity, yes, but also respect. "Miss Hart," the judge said gently, "I apologize that you had to endure this." I nodded, unable to speak. The lump in my throat was gone. The heavy weight on my chest, the guilt, the obligation, the fear had evaporated. "Your Honor," Finch squeaked, standing up, "my clients would like to withdraw the suit." "Oh, I'm sure they would," Judge Holloway said, a dark smile touching his lips. "But we are far past that point, Counselor." He picked up his gavel. It looked like a weapon.
The gavel came down. Bang. It wasn't a loud noise, but it echoed in the courtroom like a gunshot, signaling the end of the war. "Case dismissed with prejudice," Judge Holloway declared, his voice ringing with finality. "The plaintiffs are hereby barred from ever filing a claim against Miss Hart in this or any other jurisdiction." My knees felt weak, but I didn't sit. I stood taller. "Furthermore," the judge continued, staring down at my parents over his spectacles, "I am ordering the plaintiffs to pay the defendant's legal fees in full, and, given the flagrant dishonesty displayed here today, I am referring this transcript to the district attorney's office for review regarding charges of perjury and attempted fraud." My mother let out a strangled cry. "Fraud? No! We're old! You can't put us in jail!" "You attempted to use this court as a weapon to extort money you had no right to," the judge said coldly. "You wasted the court's time, and you tormented this young woman. Bailiff, please escort the plaintiffs out." My father looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face was a mask of disbelief. The script had flipped so fast he had whiplash. He looked at his lawyer for help, but Mr. Finch was already packing his briefcase, eager to distance himself from the sinking ship. As the bailiff stepped forward, my parents stood up. They looked disheveled. The poverty costume they wore suddenly didn't look like a costume anymore. It looked like their future. They turned toward the aisle. They had to pass me to leave. My mother stopped right in front of me. Her face was streaked with mascara, her eyes wide and pleading. She reached out a hand to touch my arm. "Maya," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Maya, please, you can't let them do this. We're your family. We're your mommy and daddy." I looked at her hand, the hand that signed me away for $12,000. I stepped back, just out of her reach. "I don't know who you are," I said calmly. My voice didn't shake. It was steady as a rock. "My parents gave up their rights in 2009. You're just strangers who owe me legal fees." "Maya!" my father barked, trying to summon his old intimidation tactics. "I made you!" I looked him in the eye. I didn't see a monster anymore. I just saw a sad, greedy old man, terrified of the consequences of his own actions. I didn't say anything else.
I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't laugh. I simply turned my back on them and walked toward Vance. Behind me, the bailiff's voice boomed, "Move along, folks, now!" I heard the heavy courtroom doors swing shut behind me, cutting off their protests. Outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement was slick and wet, reflecting the city lights like diamonds. The air smelled of ozone and wet concrete, the smell of a storm that had passed. Vance stood beside me, lighting a cigarette. He offered me one, but I shook my head. I didn't need anything to calm my nerves. For the first time in 15 years, I was perfectly calm. "You okay?" Vance asked, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Yeah," I said, surprised to find it was true. "I am." "They won't bother you again," he promised. "The DA doesn't take kindly to perjury. They'll be too busy fighting criminal charges to think about suing anyone." I nodded. I looked out at the city skyline, at the lights of the buildings where people were living their lives, safe in their homes. I hailed a cab. As I climbed in, I reached into my pocket. My fingers brushed against the plastic hospital bracelet I had carried with me all day as a talisman. I pulled it out. St. Mary's Hospital, 2009. It wasn't a symbol of abandonment anymore. It was a receipt. It was the proof that I had bought my own freedom, even if I hadn't known it at the time. I rolled down the window. The wind whipped my hair across my face. I held the bracelet out, opened my fingers, and let go. It tumbled into the gutter, lost among the street trash and the flowing water. "Where to?" the driver asked, eyeing me in the rearview mirror. I sat back, watching the courthouse disappear into the distance. "Home," I said, smiling. "Take me home."